Welcome to Carnegie Mellon Online. For more multimedia from Carnegie Mellon University, visit www.cmu.edu/multimedia.
Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about here is represents a pretty long-term, large research project, but I'm not going to present it that way. I'm not going to sort of present it the way I would to fellow researchers. It's right after lunch, and I'm not the only person I'm sure who gets sleepy after lunch. So instead, I'm going to present it to you in a way that is sort of, I hope, designed to answer the kinds of questions you might have come with. So let me just ask before I start, how many of you grew up in Pittsburgh? Lots, right? Good. Good. So I bet you have heard of Pittsburghese before, or at least I bet that you've heard of it recently. I don't think this term was around much before the 60s, for about the 1960s, but I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So here's what I'm going to try to get through. First of all, what are some of the features of Pittsburghese, and where do they come from? What's the history of this dialect? I'm going to try to talk about some of the other sources of influence. As we'll see, there's sort of one main historical source of influence that has given rise to this dialect, but there are some other sources as well. And then, is Pittsburghese going to die out, or is it going to persist? And finally, if there's time, I want to talk about the role of what I call the Pittsburgh diaspora, and I suppose I wouldn't be surprised if some of you were people who grew up in Pittsburgh but don't live here now, in shaping ideas about local speech. It turns out that Pittsburghers who don't live in Pittsburgh anymore are a major source of kind of discourse about attention to pride in local speech. That's one place where it really comes up. And it's always been connected with movement. So, a little bit of Pennsylvania history for those of you who, like me, have forgotten what they learned in 8th grade. Early settlers in Pennsylvania brought their languages and dialects with them. The Quakers were among the first to come. As you know, probably Philadelphia was founded by Quakers, for Quakers. And they didn't just settle in that area. They moved westward. There's still quite a few old Quaker families in central Pennsylvania, where I grew up, but not as many in this part of the state. Most of the Quakers found good farming land on the other side of the Allegheny Mountains. So that the Quakers around here tend to be more allied with Quakers in the Midwest, further west, than with the ones in the east. Also Germans, lots of Germans in this area. The Germans kind of hopscotched with the Scots-Irish, who are the next group. But the Germans got a lot of see, what people were looking for was good land. They had brought their seeds and stuff with them, and they wanted good land. And the Germans got most of the really rich agricultural land in central and eastern Pennsylvania. So in Center County, where I grew up, most of the old names are German names. The old farming families have either Quaker or German ancestry. The Scots-Irish came from Scotland. That's where they embarked, but many, that's what their families originally embarked from, but many came from families that had lived for several generations in Northern Ireland. So there was a time in the 1600s when the English royalty decided to colonize Northern Ireland to sort of subdue the locals by moving a lot of people over from Scotland. And the Ulster area of Northern Ireland, what's now Northern Ireland as opposed to the Republic of Ireland, is very heavily settled by these people. There's a quite different dialect in that part of Ireland that sounds a lot more like Lowland Scottish English or Scots. But then starting at around 1730s, but really accelerating during the 1700s, and in this area, mostly around the late 1700s, right around the time of the American Revolution and afterwards, many Scots-Irish came and settled in this area. They tended to have smaller, more hardscrabble farms because a lot of the good farming land wasn't available anymore. They tended to live in the mountains. They tended to be farmers and grow a lot of grain because they could grow grain, but it took a long time to get the grain back over the Allegheny Mountains to market. And you couldn't, it would have rotted by the time, wheat or whatever, it would have rotted by the time it got to Philadelphia to the port. So what could they do except turn it into whiskey? And this really was an economic decision. This really was about getting your crop to market. But they also drank some of it, and they've gotten a reputation now as you know, these hard drinking moonshiners, which really isn't quite accurate. It was an economic thing, but they were largely responsible for the whiskey rebellion after the American Revolution, when the government tried to, the U.S. government, the new U.S. government, tried to raise some money to pay back their war expenses by taxing whiskey. And since the local people in this area were extremely dependent on whiskey, they rebelled against that, and that started right outside of Pittsburgh. Now, as you can see, there are lots of evidence of these early Scots-Irish. Here on the right is a gravestone which is in the Cross Creek Presbyterian Church Cemetery. Cross Creek is over west of here near the West Virginia border, and it has a very old graveyard associated with a Presbyterian church. These Scots-Irish were Presbyterians. The Southern Irish were, of course, Catholics, so that was another reason for this kind of cultural difference. Her name was Mary McKibben, a typical Scots-Irish name, departed this life June 26, 1833, in the 73rd year of her life. So that means she would have emigrated to this area around the time when a lot of the Scots-Irish did. So she was this probably represents the first generation of English speakers born in this area in some way. You can see there's still lots of names from Northern Ireland around here. Armagh. I went over Route 22 and took a few pictures of road signs in Armagh, Pennsylvania, because I had a colleague who was from Northern Ireland who didn't believe me when I said there was an Armagh, Pennsylvania. But there's plenty of other names, like Strabane is a Scots-Irish name. I mean, you could just go through a map of Pennsylvania and you'd find a lot of names from England in the east and a lot of names from Northern Ireland in the western part. A lot of these, many of the Scots-Irish actually weren't from Scotland. Some of them were Huguenots. I mean, so it was a mixture. Some of them were more ethnic Irish, but largely they're thought of as Scots-Irish. Then later, of course, during the 19th century, there were huge numbers of other groups, but not so many of any one that they kind of took over. Irish in the sense of the Southern Irish, the potato famine Irish, who came around the middle of the 19th century. African Americans who started coming to Pittsburgh from the south, actually earlier than to other northern cities, and had a very distinctive culture, and still do have a distinctive culture and a distinctive way of speaking, although it's not the same as the distinctive white way of speaking. It shares some features. Immigrants from continental Europe. Now these are the immigrants that most people think of first when they think of immigrants to Pittsburgh. These are the people from Croatia, Poland, you know, the Serbians, the Italians, the Poles, the Russians. I probably have left out half the groups that maybe some of you come from. These people came to work in the steel mills, and mostly between about 1880 and 1920. Then there are currently immigrants to Pittsburgh too. More and more Central Americans, particularly Mexicans, who are settling in communities like Beachview in the South Hills, where they can take the trolley to get to work. A lot of East Asians, Indians, and so on, who are associated with the universities and with professional practices, and many live in Monroeville. I'm sure you've seen the temple out there if you're from this area. And South Asians, Russians, a lot of Russian Jewish immigrants in Squirrel Hill, so you hear Russian spoken on the street now, a lot in Squirrel Hill. So there's still, there's still migration. People complain about how few people are moving to this area, but there are some. So the dialect situation now, most scholars agree that there are now 3 major dialect areas in the US, and I'll show you a map in a minute. Pittsburgh is in the North Midland or Lower North area, depending how you divide things up. Pittsburgh speech, and this will surprise you, has one pronunciation feature that's more or less idiosyncratic. That is, there's one thing that people around Pittsburgh do that nobody else does from all the research that's been done. Everything else that people think of as Pittsburgh are shared with many speakers elsewhere. So is there a Pittsburgh dialect? Well, in some sense, yes, because there's a kind of constellation, a set of things that you hear here that you don't hear anywhere else. But in another sense, no, because there's really only one thing that people do here that they don't do anywhere else, and that is the pronunciation of ow is ah, in downtown or at, and has. This is one of the ones that gets made fun of a lot, that gets sort of has a kind of standard conventionalized spelling. But I'll go through some of the other ones in a moment, and I think you'll recognize them when you hear them, but maybe be surprised to hear that they're not just heard in Pittsburgh. So here's a map. There's no pointer over there. I didn't think of that. Anyway, I can reach it. This is what's sort of thought of as the South, and one characteristic feature here is that people pronounce words like my, my, as ma. Then there's the North, which is becoming even more and more different from the Midland. This is where people say Chicago. If you compare the speech of someone, this is going to do this a million times here, in Cleveland with someone from Pittsburgh now 2.5 hours away, their speech is markedly different, very different. You can immediately tell a difference between a young person from Cleveland and one from Pittsburgh. And not even when they're speaking in a non-standard sort of way, not even when they're not trying to speak correctly, but when they're really being careful about it. We have a linguistics student who just left from the University of Pittsburgh, whose name was Natalie, who was from Cleveland. And one of the little kids, the little kid of my colleague at Pitt, who's also a linguist, his little 4-year-old son noticed that she didn't speak the same as he did. And he went around for about a very long day saying, Natalie has an accent. And of course, Natalie told him that he had an accent too, but nobody ever believes that. And then there's some kind of city areas that are surrounded, and then alone among almost any city, there's a little circle around St. Louis. Here's the Pittsburgh area. So if you're just looking at pronunciation, the way the project was that created this map, you would find an area of a western Pennsylvania area. I think it's a mistake to have Erie in that. I think that's just they didn't interview very many people, and I think they must have interviewed someone from Pittsburgh who was living in Erie. Because people in Erie don't have the same accent. Well, whether you know or not, they don't. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about some of the pronunciation features. We'd call these phonological features. The first one is really hard to hear, and don't feel bad if you don't hear it. There's 2 vowel sounds that some people pronounce differently and hear differently, but most people don't pronounce differently. This is across the country. So I'm one of the minority who does hear and pronounce these vowels differently. For me, the word N-O-T is not the same as the word N-A-U-G-H-T. One is not and one is not. One is C-O-T is cot and C-A-U-G-H-T is caught. And although I don't actually say them very differently, I definitely hear them as belonging in different categories. How many of you hear those as belonging in different categories? Yeah, so quite a few. I think it's tends to be more older people than younger people, but I'm from central Pennsylvania, and all my friends thought they were the same, and I thought they were different. I don't really know why, except maybe my parents, who were not from there, teaching me to read. I mean, this is one of those things that you can actually learn from learning to read. If the person who's teaching you to read keeps saying, no, that's not, it's not, that might sort of force you to think, well, maybe there's a difference here. But what's happening here is that these are becoming merged. Merged means they're 2 sounds are turning into one. That's very common in the history of languages. It's happened repeatedly in the history of English. And it's happening throughout the US. The difference is that around here, people pronounce the resulting one sound, not as not, but as not. People from this area, this is one of the things that's very, very audible to me that I can hear immediately. When people say not or caught instead of not or caught. The only people that have ever noticed this, though, are outsiders. Pittsburghers don't notice it. So there was a cartoon, a Rob Rogers cartoon. Rob Rogers is a very good cartoonist in the Post-Gazette. And one time he had a cartoon about what a fancy upscale mall would look like if it were in Pittsburgh, the typical kind of, you know, what does everything look like if it's about 2 degrees more working class. And there was a body shop, B-O-D-Y shop, except it was spelled B-A-W-D-Y. But the joke was funnier if, for you, those are actually 2 different words. Yeah. So then there's the one I talked about before, the monophthongization of ow. Monophthongization means a diphthong, which is 2 sounds, ow, or I, or ow, or oi. Those are diphthongs, maybe not in writing necessarily, but in speaking, and they turn into a monophthong, that is 1 sound. So ow becomes and I becomes that second one is a typical Southern thing. It really tends to only happen before L's and R's in this area. So it's not the whole scale Southern ma. You don't really hear that too often, but you do hear towel for tile, and you also hear towel for towel. So that's there's a few words, there's a number of pairs of words that can sound the same. And they do sound the same. And the only way to tell the difference is by figuring out the context. And usually that's easy to do, so this doesn't really cause a lot of problems, but a lot of outsiders have stories about running into communicative difficulties as a result of this. I actually have one too. Walking my dog very early on when I got here in the park in the morning, you know, I don't know how many of you do this, but you just tend to talk to other dog people about what you're going to do during the day, just about nothing. And this one guy from Squirrel Hill said that what he was going to do is have workmen come and replace the towels in his bathroom. And I thought, why would you? Yeah. I thought, why can you do that yourself? So that, you know, it was not a big problem, a momentary little moment like that. But aisle and owl, for example, can sound the same. And that often goes with this final thing, which is that the final L can sound like a W sometimes. So I didn't say towel, I said towel, towel. The L turns into more of a W, it's vocalized, more like a vowel. That's very, very common around here. Even people who are really aware of their accent, really trying not to speak that way, will vocalize L's. I do it myself. Then E and U can both turn into a sort of a more relaxed sound. So instead of E, it's sometimes I. Instead of U, it's sometimes U. So a lot of people around here would pronounce feel and fill the same way. I feel bad. You know, he's out on the fill. And then fool and full, like pool and pull. A lot of people don't pronounce pool and pull differently. This is not particularly Pittsburgh. I mean, people think of it as Pittsburgh. Sometimes it's made fun of in the little jokes, but it's not really a Pittsburgh thing so much as it's everywhere. Then there's this iggle, which is very strange, in giant iggle. Yeah, but nobody... Yeah, but nobody actually says that. I mean, that's not really how Pittsburgh is pronounced. And if it really was a local thing, then people would do it in other words. It wouldn't just happen in one word. So people would say biggle for the kind of dog, but they don't. You know, you don't raise biggles. And if you look into this, this is very interesting. This actually was the invention of a marketing person doing marketing stuff for the giant eagle in the 1960s who came from Philadelphia, where they do this. So the Philadelphia Eagles, you know, the football team is. But because we've seen it so much, we go to the Eagle video, and it's even spelled Eagle this way, and they have it on their flyers that they send you in the mail and everything. People really think this is a Pittsburgh word, even though they never actually heard anybody say it this way, which is very interesting. Then there's this different ways of pronouncing a word like wash, wash. Some intrusive R just means an R that's not really there in the history of the word, or whoosh. Washington, yeah. That is very common. That's a Midwestern feature. It seems to be receding, or that is going away. You hear it less and less often. Other features. I don't know if any of you saw this on your way in. It's become a real sort of marketing gizmo. I mean, I don't know what you call this, but Subway, I mean, this international global chain, this is when people talk about globalization, they often talk about how you sort of have to reinscribe the local, you have to remind people that they're actually in a real place. So you have this global sandwich chain, and you do some little thing to remind people that they're actually in some place that isn't just every place. And what they do in Pittsburgh is they put a local word in. They don't do that everywhere. So that is one of the things. Yins is a second person plural pronoun. It's related to Yuans, U-ones. It's very common all through Appalachia, although people don't spell it this way, except here. They think here it's thought to be one word, and people have sort of lost the connection with U-ones, U-ones. It's another form of y'all. Like everything else I'll be talking about, we can't tell about the sounds. We don't have any recordings, unfortunately, of the early Scots-Irish. All we have is letters, some letters, sometimes letters written by people who weren't very literate can show you something about how they sounded or how they thought words sounded, but there's very little of that. But mostly these are all from Scots-Irish. And this one too, the infinitival copula, the shirt needs iron, the needs fixed list. That's an interesting one. The second one's from the newspaper. Those are also from Scots-Irish. People in Northern Ireland do this. People in Scotland do this. They think it's normal. The next one I think is from German. I think it's more likely from German than from Scots-Irish. And there's a little bit of research that suggests this. So instead of saying, are you from Pittsburgh? Somebody might say, you from Pittsburgh? So when the question could be answered with a yes or a no, you pass the bread. It's a question that you already think you know the answer to, or you already have some idea what the answer might be. Like, you walk past somebody's garage and they're painting their garage, and you say, paint your garage. That's an example somebody gave me who wasn't from around here. But I grew up doing this. I apologize for that. I grew up doing this and irritating my parents with it. And then an ad is a general extender. That is from and that. And it's again, not a typical, not a exclusively Pittsburgh thing. It's like et cetera and stuff like that. There are all sorts of forms of it. It tends to be found in working class speech. And I was talking to somebody about this before the talk began. When you are in a situation where you know everybody, you see the same people every day, you go to school with the same people, go to church with the same people, live in the neighborhood with the same people, work with the same people, you live in a very homogeneous world. You all live in the same world. So you can take a lot of shortcuts when you talk. A lot of stuff doesn't have to be completely explicit. So a form like this, an at, it just calls up a kind of shared world. It means that you expect that the other people know what you're talking about, and they'll be able to generate the rest of this. So that's quite common in working class speech. Other kinds of shortcuts are too. I'm getting a little hot here, so I'll take this off. So that's why I think that's one connection that it has to Pittsburgh. It's working class, and people think of Pittsburgh as working class. What about African-American Pittsburghers? Well, most of the African-Americans obviously came from the South. Not all. There were a few free African-Americans who came from the East. Originally they came from Africa, of course, and both the African origin and the Southern origin probably influenced the speech features that they brought with them. This is a contentious and interesting question about what are the origins of African-American ways of speaking English, but they have something African and something Southern about them. And in Pittsburgh, as in most other northern cities, African-Americans historically had relatively little contact with whites. Because of de facto segregation of all different kinds. And they had relatively little contact with other African Americans who lived in different neighborhoods. This is one thing that was different in Pittsburgh. Because of the topography here, there's not just one large African American neighborhood. There's a lot of smaller ones. So there was a lot of kind of social subgroups, less unity, which means that African Americans have never had much visibility in local politics. This is beginning to change. So as a result of this, we know that African-American Pittsburghers don't sound like African-Americans elsewhere. because they tell us that over and over again. But the first studies are just now being conducted. We've done field work in the Hill District and elsewhere, field work collecting samples of people's speech, interviewing them about how they feel about the place and what their social relations are like and everything. And there's a PhD student at Pitt. We don't have a linguistics department here, but Pitt does have a linguistics department, so this kind of work tends to be done there, who is writing her dissertation about this, and it will be very, very interesting. African Americans do claim some features of Pittsburghese, though. They'll say it's a white people's way of sounding, but then they'll say, but, you know, of course, I say the shirt needs ironed, or I say nebby and slippy and stuff. So what's going to happen to Pittsburghese? People are concerned about being authentic here, as elsewhere, I guess. There are reasons to expect local sounding features to disappear. And in fact, this is true around the world. This is one of the things that people have are worried about now on all sorts of different scales. I imagine you've read some articles or seen some coverage of the number of languages, whole languages, that are becoming extinct. And many linguists are very concerned about preserving those languages in some way. But dialects are dying out too. Some of the sort of sub-regional dialects, like the typical dialects of the islands off the eastern shore of the United States, like Ocracoke, some of the places where Pittsburghers go on vacation. Those places used to have very distinctive accents because they were almost completely isolated, and they had an indigenous economy. They were based on fishing. So there was very little contact, but then now more and more that's a tourist economy. In fact, it's almost exclusively a tourist economy, so people are exposed to the wider world, and suddenly their way of speaking has less value for them, and it goes away. And this has happened over and over again. In the 19th century, people started worrying about local dialects dying out, and it's then as now it had to do with social and geographic mobility, people moving around. Changes in migration patterns. So, you know, you have people coming in from elsewhere. A lot of northerners moved to the south, have been moving to the south over the last few decades. And that means that in southern cities, there's a less sort of strong southern accent, just statistically speaking, although the countryside is changing. If you think about North Carolina, for example, I mean, the huge migration from Mexico, huge migration from this area. I mean, there are probably more Pittsburghers in North and South Carolina than there are in Pittsburgh. The mass media, people often think that the mass media is changing language, probably in some ways less than you think, but it does have some effect. After all, radio has been around since the 1920s, and people didn't all suddenly start speaking the same at that point. So you can overestimate the result of the mass media, the effect of the mass media. The global economy, there's new kinds of jobs, new kinds of employers. It's, in the old days, for men anyway, if you worked in the mill, it didn't matter how you talked. It didn't even matter if you were literate particularly. If you were the foreman, it might be, in fact, to your advantage to sound like the guys that were working with you. If you sounded too different from them, they might not trust you, they might not like you. But now, more and more people work in the kinds of jobs where it matters how you talk. In fact, a lot of people have jobs where how you talk is completely scripted. You work in a call center, for example, or you work in a bank, you know, the customer service department of a bank, the phone-in department. You know, probably the most extreme example of this is offshore workers in India who do service kinds of work and have people walking around behind them making sure that they sound like Americans. And not only sound like Americans, but say exactly what's on the script in front of them. So it absolutely matters how they talk. It's quite different than before. Women have always had more jobs where it mattered how they talked. And when women in Pittsburgh started entering the workforce, they might have become teachers, they might have become receptionists. And in both those jobs, you know, it matters people think it matters how you talk. So women have always sounded a bit less Pittsburghy, a bit more standard than men. And this is true every place where you have the kind of gender relations that you have in this particular kind of economy. where women are more likely to have those kinds of service jobs. There are probably some other reasons for expecting local sounding features to disappear, and I want to come back to this if there's time for discussion afterwards. But first, I think there are also reasons to expect local sounding features to persist. You certainly see lots of evidence of Pittsburgh speech. If you go down to the Strip, if you don't live here, go down to the Strip or go to Station Square, and you see these are all from T-shirts. I have a huge collection of T-shirts. Has any of you seen Chip Tam Sam? You have? Yeah. I should have brought him.
Oh, my son loves him.
It's a doll, and when you push his, and he has on a Steeler T-shirt. He has a mullet. He's got some kind of Polish-sounding name, and when you press him in the belly, he says things in Pittsburghese. I mean, that's bizarre. That they didn't have that. You don't find that anywhere else, and it's a homegrown business. And you don't find that kind of thing in other cities. You might find little dolls that somehow represent the city, but the fact that their speech would be so important that you'd have to have a little, I don't know, whatever it is inside them. T-shirts, coffee mugs. Some of this stuff has been around for a while. There's some coffee mugs dating from the 1970s, I think, that were prizes, what do you call them, gifts you could get for donating money to radio stations. But there is more and more of this stuff now. So why would there be more and more of this stuff if local speech were disappearing? I mean, obviously, in one sense, it's quite obviously not disappearing. It has something to do with local pride. Pittsburghers are famous for being very intensely loyal, for coming back years after they leave, for having to leave but not wanting to leave. There's also a phenomenon of kind of solidarity in the face of dialect endangerment. People sort of know that maybe not everyone talks the way their grandparents did or the way they do. They may be aware that their kids don't have the same accent that they do. And they think, wait a minute, this is going away. This is an element of our heritage that's going away, and maybe we should preserve some of it. Not teach our kids to speak Pittsburghese, but at least at least try to figure out what it is and where it comes from. And I think that's probably why a lot of you are here. It's why I have a big audience whenever I talk about this. So why would people be so curious? I mean, in a sense, you're sort of part of my data here. Then there's working class pride. This is a sort of phenomenon that, as you may remember, really started in the 1980s with people like Bruce Springsteen, if you remember Bruce Springsteen, kind of working class hero, all the kind of working class movies with John Travolta in them. Movies like The Deer Hunter in 1972 was an early example of this, sort of highlighting the connections between working class youth and Vietnam, and that was actually a Pittsburgh thing, although Robert De Niro didn't speak Pittsburghese, doesn't. So that's been, and that has gone hand in hand with the decline of the actual working class economically. As there got to be fewer and fewer jobs for workers starting in the 80s, people got to be more and more sort of protective of that image, that identity. Symbols of localness have become increasingly commodified. That is, they're sort of for sale. Things like this are commodities, they're for sale. The History Museum is a commodity that puts local speech on sale or offers it, gives it some value. They don't have very much about speech there, but they have been interested in the past. So there are various ways that local speech can have a kind of value that's different from the value it would have had before. It used to have a kind of social value, but it's more and more, it comes to have a kind of economic value. People use it in the names of things. People sell, I mean, did a whole little project about these shirts, just thinking about the economics of a shirt like this. If you buy a white shirt, if you buy in bulk 500 white T-shirts like this from a place in Aliquippa, you can buy each shirt for about, already printed, for like $3.29 or something, and you can sell them for $5, $8. It's a very good markup. And that markup, what's responsible for the difference between a shirt that originally cost $1.50 in bulk and a shirt that you can sell for $8 is local speech. There's nothing else. Nothing else gives it that value. So that's it, but that's a totally different kind of value than local speech would have had before. So people don't want to be homogenized. I mean, you know, nobody wants to be exactly the same as anybody else. You know, even when you think about kids in high school, I mean, from the perspective of adults, it looks like all these kids want to be exactly like all the other kids, but they're not. They don't. They don't look exactly alike. Each one looks a little different. And that's, I think, a more general phenomenon. It's not just about social identity, it's about personal identity, too. You don't want to be just like everybody else. No matter how cool we might think some newer and more global kinds of lifestyles and activities are, we still don't want to just be like everybody else who's online or everybody else who's moving around every 2 years or whatever. So I want to just show you a little bit about one way that this kind of works, that local speech is now getting kind of reformulated, that its meaning is getting reformulated. It doesn't really mean, it's not, I mean, there are people who can sort of turn local speech on because they want to sound like locals, but those are not the same people who sound that way all the time. They're doing it for a different reason. It has a different kind of value now. So a little bit about Pittsburghese and the Steeler Nation. The Steeler Nation is one term for the Pittsburgh diaspora. And the NFL actually made a film about the Steeler Nation. I don't know whether any of you saw it. I don't think it was aired very often, but and they actually had a segment about Pittsburgh speech in it, because this is one of the things that people sort of cling to. Now, it's not, a lot of this is going to be familiar to anybody in this room. Many Pittsburghers have moved elsewhere to find work, starting in the 1960s, when the steel industry started to contract. And as I said before, geographic mobility typically leads to dialect leveling. So that what you get is, you don't get everyone in the US sounding the same, but you get a kind of northern sound, a kind of middle sound, a kind of southern sound, and that's about all there is in the way of differentiation. But on the other hand, geographic mobility also leads to dialect awareness. And I think I was talking to you right before this about how that works. You move to Boston, and somebody tells you you sound funny, and you never realized you sounded funny before. So suddenly you become aware of your accent. It doesn't just happen. You don't just become aware of a local accent because everyone you hear has that accent. If everyone you hear sounds the same, you don't become aware of it. So everybody talked that way. So older people that I talked to in the interviews I did would say, yeah, I'm sure we said yins when we were growing up, but we just didn't hear it. Everybody did it. It was just not audible. It wasn't, you didn't notice it. You couldn't notice it. So geographic mobility is what leads to dialect awareness. So you have this kind of very interesting paradox, I think. This is really what drives my project, is that at the same time that the dialect is kind of going away, people are becoming aware of it. They're almost in a kind of complementary relationship. And when Pittsburghers elsewhere and here talk about Pittsburgh identity, they often talk about Pittsburgh speech. So one of the mechanisms that accounts for this kind of increased awareness and this increased connection of local speech with local identity and its increased use as a commodity is that it comes up when people are talking about local identity. It's a way that you can frame local identity. I don't know whether any of you have been to a Steeler bar or anywhere else, but here's one in Washington, and notice what they have at the, this is on the ceiling basically, or on a rafter. I'd like an arn, A-H-R-N, a chip chop sandwich, and a gumban. Give me a shinlin arn and a impanarn. And then I don't know what this has a cord in front of it. Steelers, I don't know what the next word is, but no jagoffs. Ain't no jagoffs, is that it? And then down here they have a t-shirt that has some Pittsburgh words on it. So this is one of the kind of places where people gather. The Steeler Nation film that they made had a lot of footage of these kinds of Steeler bars. They're all over the country. There's a website where you can go to find a list of all the Steeler bars. So I decided one way we have gone about studying this is that I did a study of a discussion board that took place on WTAE in 1990, starting in 2000. This actually got started when there was some news coverage of a workshop about local speech that we were having here. But we had nothing to do with it. I did not suggest it to this station. So it was kind of a grassroots thing. So they put up questions about local news. I mean, they have discussions about local news. This one lasted far longer than any other discussion they'd ever had. Usually these last a couple of weeks. We tracked it for 9 months, and people were still contributing, although not too much anymore. There were 101 participants, and they made 180 responses, so it's quite a robust set of data here. And here's a sample contribution. Hey, Jens, guys, I'm also an ex-Burger. Well, actually, Wishington County, now in Virginia, too. When I first went to college at Edinburgh, I tried to get rid of my accent because other students and even the professors were pointed out. Why is it charming to have an accent from one region and not another? It should not be embarrassing. It does not mean we are not intelligent people. I am proud of being from the Pittsburgh area. I think that the area is an incredible melting pot of many different cultures. And if it's such an embarrassment to talk this way, if we sound stupid, how come I'm a university professor and I still say gumbands pop and drop the G off any word ending in ing? It's an interesting argument. I mean, this is an interesting little rhetorical task here. But one thing I want you to notice is how she establishes that she has a kind of authentic right to speak about this. She identifies herself as a university professor, but at the very beginning she says, hey, Jens, guys, I'm also an ex-Burger. Actually, Wishington County. So the very first thing she does is she shows that she knows something about local speech by doing some local speech. And people do this over and over again. This is, if you want to make a little argument like this, and this is an interesting argument, you know, why would people think this is stupid if university professors do it? Why do we like some accents and not others? It's a pretty sophisticated argument, but at the very beginning she has to show that she knows what local speech sounds like. And that's one way that these things circulate. So people on this discussion board, and I think this is quite common, the people who study these sorts of things find this, that people often, without even being prompted to, will provide information about where they're from, and especially in a discussion like this, where in order to get the floor, it's important that people know where you're from. So 65 of these people, even without being asked, provided relevant information, like I was born and raised in the Pittsburgh area, et cetera. And of those 65, which we have information about, 43 of them were Pittsburghers who lived elsewhere. So that's a pretty big percentage. And if it's true, if that same distribution is true for the whole sample of 101, there's no reason to think it isn't, just because the other people didn't say anything about where they were from. It shows that this discussion is pretty dominated by people who are members of the Pittsburgh diaspora. That's who contributes to this discussion. And I think it makes sense. I mean, people who live elsewhere don't maybe subscribe to the paper or they certainly don't listen to local TV, but they may go to the website and check up on things there. Many moved away in the 1980s, so many of them said, I've been gone for 20 years. So what did they talk about? What did they mention? Sounds, words that are different in other dialects. They talked about y'all, because many of them were living in the South. I'm surrounded by y'allers now. I'm the only Yenzer I know anymore. One person said, I live in Minnesota now, and they say a boot. They say things like a boot, or I live in the South, and they drop their R's. They also mention words and sounds that are connected with being local, with a local lifestyle, especially a local lifestyle that a child might have, because they're remembering their childhood mostly, or their adolescence maybe. So they talk about things like this. On Sunday we washed the cars, and notice again he's sort of performing local speech and writing. And as kids we were given pop for a treat. We have gum bands on our desk. Jeet Jumbo, doesn't really make sense. Red Up, and then there is all the time. And then there is all the time Great One Annette. So it doesn't quite make sense at the end, but notice that how many of the words and activities that he alludes to are sort of childhood things. On Saturday, we washed the cars, for example. And they also mention sounds and words connected with places. So they say downtown a lot. They spell it that way, and they talk about the Mon. The Mon. I don't know that they would pronounce it that way, but I'm pretty sure that they meant the Mon, not the Mon.
What is the derivation of red?
Oh, that's Scotch-Irish. Yeah, it's not. People think it's German, but it's similar to a German word, and that may be partly responsible for why it's stuck around, but it's really from Scots-Irish.
G is used as a question. G plunge, yeah?
Yeah. So it doesn't quite fit there. It really doesn't fit there. But notice how eager this person is to stick that in there somewhere because he thinks it's a Pittsburgh thing. So he puts it in even though it doesn't really fit. So what people are doing in this discussion is they're kind of connecting place and a dialect and identity. And they're doing this in different ways. So here's one conversation. You must be from Cleveland. So what's interesting is people in Cleveland don't do this. They don't link their identity with language, but Pittsburghers do all the time. So thank you very much. To find out more, we have a website, and you're welcome to email me. The website is going to be upgraded sometime in the next 2 months, and it's going to even have some podcasts on it with explanations of local words. But it's also going to have a lot of other stuff. It has some samples from the interviews and has some explanations of some other things.
Thank you for staying connected with Carnegie Mellon University. To learn more, go to www.cmu.edu.